The invitation had arrived on parchment that smelled of winter roses and bitter irony, written in Lucian's familiar script. You are cordially invited to witness the union that will secure our realm's future. Serena's fingers had trembled as she read those words, each letter a blade, twisting deeper into wounds that had never properly healed. He wanted her there. He wanted her to watch him pledge eternity to another woman, to stand among the guests and smile as if her heart hadn't been carved out and left bleeding in the castle's shadow. But Darius had other plans. The young man beside her moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate shadows before he could properly walk. His dark hair caught the torchlight as they approached the castle gates, and beneath his pale skin, something ancient stirred. Serena felt the weight of countless eyes upon them as they crossed the threshold, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that spoke of protection, of claims that ran deeper than blood. The great hall fell silent. Musicians stopped mid-note, their instruments hanging forgotten in hands that suddenly seemed too heavy. Crystal goblets froze halfway to lips that had been preparing to toast the vampire lord's calculated alliance. The bride herself, resplendent in silver silk that caught the candlelight like captured moonbeams, turned slowly from her position beside the altar where Lucian stood waiting. And then the whispers began. They rippled through the assembled crowd like wind through autumn leaves, carrying words that made the older vampires lean forward with sudden interest. The markings beneath Darius's skin had begun to glow, faint as dying embers, but unmistakable to those who remembered the old bloodlines. The symbols traced patterns along his forearms, across his collarbones, ancient script that spoke of power and birthright, and claims that could not be ignored. Serena lifted her chin, meeting Lucian's stare across the crowded hall. His pale eyes had gone wide with something between shock and recognition, his breath catching in his throat, though he had no need for air. The ceremony that was meant to seal his future had suddenly become something else entirely, something that would require answers he was not prepared to give. "Who is this boy?" The voice belonged to Councillor Aldrich, ancient even by vampire standards, his words cutting through the whispers like a blade through silk. He stepped forward, his ceremonial robes rustling with each measured step, the weight of centuries pressing down upon the hall. What bloodline does he claim? Serena felt Darius tense beneath her touch, but she squeezed his shoulder gently, a silent reminder to remain calm. They had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed it through long nights when the castle slept and only the shadows bore witness to their planning. She had taught him the old protocols, the ways of standing and speaking that would command respect rather than suspicion. "He claims nothing," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "But the blood claims him. Lady Vivian, the bride whose perfect wedding had just become a battlefield, stepped forward. Her silver circlet caught the light as she moved, but her eyes were sharp with intelligence that went far beyond mere beauty. She had built her reputation on strategy, on reading the currents of power that flowed through their dark realm like hidden rivers. "The blood claims many things," Vivian said, her tone carefully neutral. "But not all claims are legitimate." The challenge hung in the air between them, polite but unmistakable. Serena had expected this, had known that Vivian would not surrender her position without a fight. The woman had spent months preparing for this union, had negotiated treaties and alliances that depended upon her marriage to Lucian. She would not step aside simply because an old lover had arrived with mysterious company. "Then perhaps," Serena replied, matching Vivian's careful tone, "we should let the old ways decide." A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. The old ways. The testing rituals that had not been invoked in decades, ceremonies that predated the current political arrangements and answered only to the deepest laws of their kind. It was a dangerous gambit, one that could either vindicate her claims or destroy what little standing she had left. Lucian finally found his voice. Serena. Her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse, heavy with memories of what they had shared and lost. "What are you doing here?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the sharp cut of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the familiar curve of his mouth that had once whispered promises in the darkness. He was exactly as beautiful as she remembered, exactly as devastating. But now she saw something else in his face, something that might have been fear. "I'm keeping my word," she said simply. "You invited me to witness this union. Here I am. This was not what I intended. Perhaps not." She stepped forward, guiding Darius with her, and the crowd parted before them like water. But intentions and consequences are rarely the same thing, are they? The words carried weight beyond their surface, meaning references to decisions made in shadowed rooms, to choices that had torn apart everything they had built together. A year ago, Lucian had chosen ambition over love, had decided that securing his territory mattered more than honoring his promises to her. He had cast her aside with pretty words about duty and responsibility, about the greater good that required his sacrifice. He had never asked what she might be sacrificing in return. Now, as autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter, as the procession of candles approached and the ancient rhythms of their world continued their eternal dance, Serena had returned to collect what was owed. Not for herself. That pain had been carved into something harder, something that could bear the weight of her resolve. For Darius, who deserved better than the shadows where she had hidden him, who carried in his veins the proof of everything Lucian had tried to forget. The boy stepped forward then, moving with unconscious grace that spoke of noble blood despite his simple clothing. The markings beneath his skin pulsed brighter as he approached the altar, responding to something in the sacred space that made the older vampires lean forward with renewed interest. "My lord," Darius said, his voice carrying despite its youth, "I seek no crown, no throne, no power beyond what serves this realm. But I seek acknowledgement of what I am." His words were carefully chosen, respectful but firm, the product of long hours of coaching from Serena. She had taught him the delicate balance required to navigate vampire politics, the way to assert rights without seeming to threaten the established order. But even she had not expected the way his presence would affect the sacred objects around him. The ceremonial chalice on the altar began to hum, its ancient metal responding to something in Darius's blood. The sound was barely audible, but in the supernatural silence of the hall, it rang like a bell. The torches flickered, their flames bending toward him as if drawn by an invisible force. And the bracelet on his wrist, the one Serena had found in the autumn market, hidden among mundane trinkets and forgotten treasures, began to warm against his skin. She had known it was significant the moment she saw it, had recognized the living metal that was used only for the highest bloodlines. The merchant who sold it to her had no idea what he possessed, had traded it for a handful of coins and a smile. But Serena had spent years learning to recognize the signs of forgotten power, had made it her business to understand the symbols that others overlooked. Now, as the bracelet responded to the sacred atmosphere of the wedding hall, those symbols began to make themselves known. The metal grew warm, then hot, then began to glow with the same inner light that marked Darius's skin. Ancient script appeared along its surface, words in the old tongue that spoke of lineage and duty and claims that transcended mere politics. Councillor Aldrich stepped closer, his ancient eyes fixed on the bracelet with something approaching awe. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "In the market," Serena replied honestly, "among the autumn offerings." "Impossible. These were destroyed." He stopped himself, glancing toward Lucian with an expression Serena couldn't quite read. These were thought to be lost. The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. If the bracelet was genuine, if it truly belonged to one of the royal bloodlines, then everything about the evening ceremony would have to change. The marriage contracts that had been so carefully negotiated, The alliances that depended upon Lucian's union with Vivian, the future they had all planned, it would all have to be reconsidered. Vivienne stepped forward again, her silk dress rustling with each careful movement. "Surely there must be tests," she said, her voice maintaining its diplomatic calm despite the chaos erupting around her carefully laid plans. "Ways to verify such claims before we overturn established agreements." "There are," Aldrich confirmed, though his gaze never left the glowing bracelet. "The old trials, the testing of blood and will and heritage that our ancestors established." "Then let them be called," Serena said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. This was the moment she had both hoped for and dreaded, the point where all their careful preparation would either vindicate her choices or destroy them both. Lucian moved then, stepping down from the altar with movements that seemed too controlled, too careful. He approached slowly, as if walking toward his own execution, and Serena felt something twist in her chest at the expression in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also something that might have been relief. "Serena," he said again, and this time her name carried different weight. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was soft, meant for her alone, but in the supernatural silence of the hall, every word carried. She looked at him, at the man she had loved and lost, at the vampire lord who had chosen duty over desire and was now facing the consequences of that choice. "You made your decision," she replied just as softly. "I made mine." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. She had not brought Darius here for revenge, though the symmetry of it was not lost on her. She had not come to destroy Lucian's carefully constructed future out of spite, though the temptation had been there during the long, lonely months of exile. She had come because Darius deserved better than the shadows where fear had hidden him. Because the boy had rights that transcended her personal pain, heritage that could not be denied simply because acknowledging it would be inconvenient. She had come because sometimes the greatest act of love was forcing the beloved to face the truth they had been running from. And as the winter wind howled around the castle walls and the torches flickered in their brackets, as the assembled vampires waited to see how this night would reshape their carefully ordered world, Serena prepared to discover whether that love had been worth the price they would all have to pay. The ceremony that was meant to secure the realm's future had become something else entirely, something that would test not just bloodlines and ancient laws, but the bonds between hearts that had been broken and might yet be mended. But first, they would have to survive what was coming next. The procession of candles began at midnight, 3 days after the wedding that never was. Serena watched from her assigned quarters in the castle's east wing as hundreds of flickering flames wound their way through the courtyards below, each vampire carrying a candle that represented their station, their lineage, their place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of their realm. The tradition was ancient, predating even the oldest members of the council, and tonight it would serve as more than ceremony. Tonight it would be judgment. Darius stood beside her at the window, his face pale in the candlelight that filtered up from below. The bracelet on his wrist had not stopped glowing since that first night in the hall, its ancient metal pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. The markings beneath his skin had grown more pronounced as well, spreading in delicate patterns across his arms and chest like a map of veins made of starlight. "Are you ready?" Serena asked, though she knew the question was unfair. How could anyone be ready for what lay ahead? The trials that Councillor Aldrich had invoked were older than memory, designed to test not just blood but character, not just heritage but worthiness. They would strip away pretense and reveal truth in its rawest form. "I have to be," Darius replied, his voice steady despite his youth. She had raised him to be strong, had taught him that strength was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make his choices. Now she would discover whether those lessons had taken root. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Vivienne entered without waiting for permission, her silver gown replaced by the deep blue robes of a mediator. The change in clothing was significant. She had formally withdrawn her claim as bride and taken on the role of neutral arbiter, a position that required her to set aside personal interest in favor of justice. "It's time," Vivienne said, though her eyes never quite met Serena's. The past 3 days had been a delicate dance of negotiation and preparation, conversations held in shadowed alcoves and whispered conferences that stretched into the pale hours before dawn. Vivienne had surprised everyone, perhaps even herself, by accepting the dissolution of her engagement with Grace that spoke more of strategy than submission. Serena had come to respect the other woman during those tense discussions. Vivienne was not the shallow beauty she had appeared to be on that first night. She was a politician in the truest sense, someone who understood that sometimes victory required tactical retreat, that sometimes the greatest power came from knowing when to step aside. "The council has agreed to your terms," Vivienne continued, finally meeting Serena's gaze. "The testing will follow the old protocols with full witness and binding results. But you understand what you're risking?" Serena nodded. If Darius failed the trials, if the blood claims proved false or insufficient, they would both be exiled from the realm forever. Not just banished from court or stripped of position, but cast out entirely, forbidden from seeking shelter in any territory that recognized the council's authority. It was a death sentence wrapped in diplomatic language. But if he succeeded, the realm will have a new heir, Serena said quietly. Someone who can bridge the old bloodlines and the new alliances. Someone who represents unity rather than division. It was a pretty speech, the kind of thing that sounded noble in the abstract. But they all knew the reality was messier, more dangerous. If Darius was acknowledged as true heir, it would mean that Lucien's claim to leadership was called into question. Not necessarily overthrown. The vampire lord still commanded loyalty and respect, but challenged in ways that could fracture the realm if not handled carefully. They made their way through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old stone, past tapestries that depicted the great battles and alliances of centuries past. Serena found herself memorizing details she had never noticed before, storing up images against the possibility that she might never see these halls again. The castle had been her home once, before love turned bitter and choice turned cruel. Now it might become her graveyard. The great hall had been transformed for the ceremony. The altar where Lucien and Vivienne should have been wed now held the instruments of testing, a silver chalice filled with wine that would reveal bloodline truth, ancient stones that would measure the strength of will, and a blade that had tasted the blood of every legitimate heir for the past 1,000 years. The assembled vampires stood in careful formations that spoke of politics as much as protocol. The older bloodlines clustered near the altar, their faces grave with the weight of what they were about to witness. Younger vampires, those whose power came from alliance rather than ancestry, watched from the periphery with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern. And at the center of it all stood Lucien, magnificent in black velvet that made his pale skin seem to glow in the candlelight. He had not spoken to Serena directly since that first night, had communicated only through intermediaries and formal channels, but she felt his gaze on her now, heavy with questions and regrets that neither of them was prepared to voice. Councillor Aldrich stepped forward, his ancient voice carrying easily through the hushed space. "We gather tonight under the old laws to witness testing that will bind us all. Let no one speak falsely. Let no one act without honor. Let the blood reveal what words cannot hide." The ritual began with fire. Darius was led to the center of the hall, where a circle of candles marked the sacred space. As he stepped within that boundary, the flames leaped higher, responding to something in his presence that made the assembled vampires murmur with recognition. The bracelet on his wrist grew brighter, its glow reflecting off the polished stone floor. State your name and your claim, Aldrich commanded. I am Darius, the young man replied, his voice carrying clearly despite his nerves. I claim no throne, seek no crown, but ask acknowledgement of the blood that flows in my veins and the heritage that cannot be denied. It was the formula they had practiced, humble enough to avoid offense, but firm enough to assert his rights. Serena felt her heart clench as she watched him stand alone in that circle of light, so young and brave and vulnerable. She had brought him here, had made the choice that led to this moment. If he failed, if the trials destroyed him, the blame would be hers alone. The first test was blood. Aldrich approached with the silver chalice, its ancient metal gleaming in the candlelight. Drink, he commanded, and let the wine reveal what you are. Darius took the chalice with steady hands, though Serena could see the slight tremor in his fingers. The wine within was not ordinary vintage. It was mixed with essences that would react to supernatural bloodlines, revealing truth that could not be faked or hidden. If his heritage was genuine, the wine would glow. If it was false, it would turn black as poison. He drank without hesitation, draining the chalice in 3 measured swallows. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall held its breath, waiting for the wine to work its ancient magic. Then slowly, a soft silver light began to emanate from Darius's skin, starting at his lips and spreading outward like dawn, breaking over still water. A collective gasp rose from the assembled vampires. The light was unmistakable, the sign of royal blood, undiluted by common heritage. But more than that, it carried undertones that spoke of specific lineage, of connections to the founding bloodlines that had established their realm in the dark centuries past. Lucian stepped forward, his face pale, even by vampire standards. "How is this possible?" he whispered, though his words carried in the supernatural silence. Serena met his gaze across the sacred circle. "Because you weren't the only one who made sacrifices for duty," she said quietly. "Because some choices have consequences that take years to reveal themselves." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that only they fully understood. A year and a half ago, before Lucian had chosen political alliance over personal desire, before he had cast her aside for the greater good of the realm, they had shared more than just passion. They had shared hope for a future that would unite rather than divide, dreams of children who would bridge the old rivalries and create something new. She had discovered her pregnancy only after he had already announced his engagement to Vivian, had hidden the truth not out of spite, but out of fear, fear that he would feel trapped, would marry her out of duty rather than love, would come to resent both her and the child for derailing his careful plans. Better to disappear, she had thought. Better to raise their son in safety and obscurity than to use him as a weapon in political games. But hiding had its own costs. Darius had grown up knowing he was different, knowing that his heritage set him apart from the human guardians who had raised him in those first crucial years. He had questioned why his mother spoke of courts and castles with such longing, why she taught him protocols and etiquette for a world he had never seen. Now, as the silver light faded from his skin but left its mark on the consciousness of every vampire in the hall, those questions finally had answers. The second test was will. Ancient stones were placed before Darius, each one carved with symbols that represented different aspects of leadership: justice, mercy, strength, wisdom, sacrifice. He was told to choose 3, and his choices would reveal the character of his rule, should he ever claim power. Serena watched with bated breath as he studied the stones. They had discussed this test, had talked about the political implications of each choice. Justice and strength were expected, almost mandatory for any ruler. But the third choice would define him in the eyes of the council. Darius reached out without hesitation, his fingers closing around the stones that called to him. Justice, as expected. Mercy, which brought approving nods from the older vampires. And then, to Serena's surprise and pride, sacrifice, the stone that spoke of putting the needs of others before personal desire. It was the choice of a true king, the mark of someone who understood that power was responsibility rather than privilege. But it was also dangerous, the choice of someone who might be too willing to set aside his own happiness for the greater good. Serena found herself thinking of Lucian, of the sacrifice that had driven them apart, and wondered if their son was doomed to repeat the patterns of the past. The third test was the most dangerous. The ancient blade, its edge sharp enough to cut shadow, required Darius to offer his own blood to the testing. If he was truly of royal heritage, the blade would sing in response to his essence. If he was not, it would reject him violently, potentially fatally. "Are you certain?" Aldrich asked, his ancient eyes studying Darius with something that might have been grandfatherly concern. "This test cannot be undone. Once begun, it must be completed regardless of consequence." "I'm certain," Darius replied, though Serena could hear the tremor in his voice that spoke of very human fear beneath supernatural courage. He took the blade with reverence appropriate to its age and power. The metal felt warm in his hands, almost alive, and as he drew it carefully across his palm, a single drop of crimson fell to the sacred stones below. The blade sang, not literally. Vampires had no need for crude musical metaphors, but every supernatural sense in the hall registered the harmonic resonance that rose from the ancient metal, a frequency that spoke of recognition and acceptance and profound rightness. The sound was beautiful and terrible, carrying echoes of every legitimate ruler who had ever bled upon that edge. And in that moment, as the song of the blade faded into reverent silence, Darius was transformed from pretender to heir, from hidden secret to acknowledged prince. But acknowledgement, Serena realized as she watched the expressions shift throughout the hall, was only the beginning of their troubles. Lucian approached the sacred circle, his movements careful and controlled. "My son," he said, and hearing the words spoken aloud for the first time made something inside Serena's chest crack with emotion she had thought herself beyond feeling. "My Lord Father," Darius replied, following the formal protocol despite the personal chaos that had to be raging within him. "I have been blind," Lucian continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Blinded by duty, by fear, by the belief that sacrifice always demanded the surrender of happiness. I cast aside the greatest treasure of my existence because I thought it was necessary for the realm's survival." He turned then, his pale eyes finding Serena across the sacred space. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that went far beyond personal reconciliation. If Lucian acknowledged that his treatment of Serena had been unjust, if he accepted that his political marriage to Vivian had been based on false premises, then everything would have to change. But change, Serena was beginning to understand, was exactly what their realm needed. Vivian stepped forward then, her blue robes rustling with each measured step. "The trials are complete," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her role as mediator. "The heritage is proven, the bloodline acknowledged, the heir recognized." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled vampires with the weight of political calculation behind it. But acknowledgement raises questions that must be answered. Questions of succession, of alliance, of the future that we will build together. Serena felt her breath catch. This was the moment she had both hoped for and dreaded, the point where personal vindication would either transform into political revolution or collapse under the weight of practical reality. "I propose," Vivian continued, "that we invoke the ancient rite of the terrace hearing to be held at the next new moon. Let all questions be asked openly, let all concerns be voiced honestly, and let the realm decide how to move forward with wisdom rather than haste." It was brilliant political maneuvering, Serena realized. The terrace hearing would give everyone time to adjust to the new reality, would allow for careful negotiation rather than dramatic upheaval. It would also give Darius time to prove himself worthy of the heritage he had just claimed. But it would also mean weeks of uncertainty, of political maneuvering, of dangers that none of them could fully anticipate. As the assembled vampires began to disperse, as the candles burned lower in their brackets and the ancient stones were carefully returned to their places of honor, Serena found herself alone with her son and the man she had never stopped loving despite everything that had passed between them. The real testing, she realized, was just beginning. The winter storm struck 3 days before the terrace hearing, as if the heavens themselves sought to disrupt the careful plans that had been laid in the wake of Darius's acknowledgement. Serena stood in the castle's highest tower, watching lightning tear across the sky while thunder shook the ancient stones beneath her feet. Below, the ceremonial bells that should have announced the new moon gathering lay scattered across the courtyards, their bronze voices silenced by winds that howled like the voices of the damned. "The terrace will be flooded," Vivian observed, joining her at the rain-lashed window. The former bride had become an unexpected ally in the weeks since the testing, her political acumen proving invaluable as they navigated the treacherous currents of vampire politics. "We'll need an alternative location for the hearing," Serena nodded, though her attention was divided between the storm and the conversation taking place in the chamber below. Through the ancient stones, her supernatural hearing could pick up the heated debate between Lucian and the council members who had arrived for the ceremony. Some supported Darius's claim wholeheartedly, seeing in him the bridge between old traditions and new necessities. Others questioned whether acknowledging a bastard heir, however legitimate his blood, would set dangerous precedents for the realm's stability. But it was the third faction that worried her most. Those who whispered that perhaps it was time for new leadership entirely, that the chaos surrounding Darius's revelation proved that Lucian himself was unfit to rule. "There's something else," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to the whisper that vampires used when they needed absolute privacy. "Eleanor found something in the archive chambers, something that changes everything." Elena was the elderly artisan who had been teaching Serena the musical sequences that opened the castle's hidden passages. The woman had proven to be more than just a keeper of forgotten melodies. She was a guardian of secrets that predated the current political arrangements by centuries. "What kind of something?" Serena asked, though she suspected she already knew. The past weeks had been full of revelations, each one peeling away layers of assumed truth to reveal complexities that no one had anticipated. "A marriage contract," Vivian replied, "ancient but still binding under the old laws. Between Lucian's bloodline and yours, signed by ancestors so distant that their names have been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars." Serena felt her breath catch. "That's impossible. My family line is not your mother's line," Vivian corrected gently. "The bloodline you thought was merely human. Elena has been researching ever since the night Darius proved his heritage, trying to understand how the royal markers could have manifested so strongly. The answer is that they came from both sides. The implications hit Serena like physical blows. If her maternal bloodline carried royal heritage, if there was indeed an ancient marriage contract binding their families, then everything about the past year's political maneuvering had been based on false premises. Lucian's engagement to Vivian, his abandonment of their relationship, his careful construction of alliances, all of it would have been unnecessary. "Does he know?" she whispered. "Not yet." Elena wanted to verify the documents before presenting them to the council, but Serena... Vivian paused, studying her with eyes that had grown gentle despite their supernatural intensity. "If this is true, if the contract holds legal weight, then you and Lucian were never free to marry others. Any unions outside of your families would be considered illegitimate under the old laws." The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very elements were holding their breath. Serena gripped the stone windowsill until her knuckles went white. processing implications that threatened to reshape not just her personal understanding, but the entire political landscape of their realm. "There's more," Vivian continued, her voice barely audible even to vampire hearing. "The contract includes provisions for shared rule, not just marriage but partnership in governance. If acknowledged, it would make you not just Lucien's wife, but his equal in power." Before Serena could respond, the chamber door burst open with enough force to splinter ancient wood. Darius stood in the doorway, his young face pale with urgency, the markings beneath his skin glowing with agitation that spoke of supernatural senses detecting danger. "Mother, you need to come quickly," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Something's happened to Father." They found Lucien in the castle's great library, collapsed among scattered books and parchments that spoke of desperate research conducted in the dark hours before dawn. His normally perfect composure was shattered, his dark hair disheveled, his pale eyes wide with something between wonder and terror. "The Chronicles," he whispered, as Serena knelt beside him, her hands automatically checking for injuries that could have felled a vampire lord. "I've been reading the old Chronicles, trying to understand how I could have been so blind." "Serena, your mother—" "I know," she said quietly, helping him to sit upright against the leather-bound volumes that surrounded them. "Vivian told me about the contract." Lucien's laugh was bitter and raw. "Not just the contract, the prophecies. The old women who read omens in blood and starlight, who recorded their visions for posterity." He gestured weakly toward the scattered papers. "They saw this, all of it. Our separation, Darius's hidden heritage, the choice that would tear the realm apart unless we found the courage to unite what politics had divided." Serena felt ice forming in her veins, despite the supernatural warmth that normally sustained her. "What choice?" "The council is fracturing," Lucien replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Half support Darius as heir, but want me removed as unfit for having hidden his existence. The other half question his legitimacy despite the trials and seek to install a regent who would guide him until he comes of age." He met her eyes with intensity that made her soul ache. "There's only one way to preserve both his future and the realm's stability." Understanding crashed over her like the storm winds outside. "The ancient marriage, formal acknowledgement of the contract. More than that." Lucien struggled to his feet, his movements speaking of exhaustion that went beyond physical weariness. "A true bonding. The old ritual that joins not just lives, but power itself. It would make us indivisible in the eyes of the law, would guarantee Darius's succession while uniting the opposing factions under shared leadership." Darius stepped forward, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. "And if you refuse?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. If Serena refused the bonding, if she chose personal pride over political necessity, the realm would indeed fracture. Some territories would follow Lucien, others would demand new leadership, and civil war would tear apart everything their people had built. But if she accepted, if she bound herself to the man who had already broken her heart once— "I need time to think," she said, rising to face the two men who represented everything she had ever loved and lost. "Time is something we no longer have," Vivian said from the doorway. Her political composure had cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath the diplomatic mask. "The storm has brought more than rain. Riders from the eastern territories bearing news that will force our hand." They gathered in the war room, its ancient maps and strategic markers providing backdrop for revelations that would reshape their understanding of the current crisis. The riders who had braved the storm were mud-soaked and exhausted, but their message was clear. The neighboring realms had learned of Darius's acknowledgement and were testing the borders, probing for weaknesses in a domain they perceived as politically unstable. "3 separate incursions," reported Captain Marcus, his grizzled face grim with the weight of military necessity. "Nothing major yet, but the pattern suggests coordination." They're waiting to see how we resolve the succession question before deciding whether to respect our territorial claims. Councillor Aldrich, his ancient features drawn with weariness, spread his hands on the table's surface. The old laws are clear. A realm in transition cannot claim full sovereignty until the succession is settled beyond question. If we delay much longer, we invite invasion from forces that have coveted our lands for centuries. Serena found herself studying the maps, tracing boundary lines with her finger while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Every choice led to sacrifice. Every path demanded payments that seemed too high to bear. "There is another option," she said quietly, her words cutting through the tense discussion like a blade through silk. One that the prophecies mentioned, but that everyone seems eager to ignore. Lucian looked up from the dispatches he had been reading, his pale eyes focusing on her with intensity that made her breath catch. "What option?" "Abdication," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You step down as Lord, I formally acknowledge the ancient contract and claim joint rulership with Darius as primary heir. The realm gets the unity it needs, the succession question is resolved, and you..." She paused, swallowing hard. "You get freedom from choices that have brought nothing but pain." The silence that followed was deeper than the storm, heavier than the ancient stones that surrounded them. She could see the wheels turning in every mind present, calculating the political implications of such a radical shift. It was Darius who spoke first, his young voice carrying wisdom that seemed impossible for his years. "That's not what any of us want," he said firmly. "Not you, not father, not the realm. You're offering to sacrifice yourself just like he did, and it would solve nothing." "Darius! No, mother!" He stepped forward, the markings beneath his skin glowing with conviction that made him seem older than his 17 years. "I've watched you both tear yourselves apart with noble sacrifices and dutiful choices. I've seen what happens when people choose what they think is right instead of what they know is true." He looked between them, his expression carrying echoes of both their faces. "The truth is that you love each other. The truth is that you're stronger together than apart. The truth is that this realm needs leaders who understand that sometimes the hardest choice is to choose happiness." Lucian moved then, crossing the room with vampire swiftness to kneel before Serena's chair. His pale hands covered hers, warm despite their supernatural nature, and when he spoke, his voice carried conviction that made the ancient stones seem to lean in to listen. "I was wrong," he said, the words falling like tears in the candlelit chamber. "Wrong to choose duty over love. Wrong to think that sacrifice always demanded surrender of joy. Wrong to believe that I could build a better future on the foundation of our destruction." His grip tightened, desperate and gentle at once. "I will spend eternity regretting the choice that drove us apart. But I will not compound that mistake by asking you to sacrifice yourself for sins that are mine alone to bear." "Then what do you propose?" Serena whispered, her composure finally cracking under the weight of emotions she had tried so hard to control. "The truth," he replied simply. "The ancient marriage, acknowledged and celebrated. Partnership in power, in life, in all things. The bonding ritual that will unite our strengths and guarantee Darius's inheritance." He paused, his pale eyes searching her face with desperate hope. "A real marriage, Serena. Not for politics or duty or the good of the realm, but because I love you. Because I never stopped loving you. Because spending one more day without you feels like a death I cannot survive." The storm outside chose that moment to quiet, its fury exhausting itself against the castle's ancient defenses. In the sudden calm, Serena could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the pull of bonds that had never truly been severed despite everything that had passed between them. "The council will need to approve the bonding," Aldrich said gently, his ancient voice carrying the weight of political reality. "But given the circumstances, given the external threats and the internal divisions, I believe they will find it acceptable." Vivienne stepped forward, her diplomatic mask finally abandoned in favor of something that might have been relief. More than acceptable, necessary. The realm needs unity, needs strength, needs leaders who understand that sometimes love and duty are not enemies, but allies. Serena looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had become family, despite the political chaos that had brought them together. Darius, so young and brave and wise. Vivienne, who had chosen grace over bitterness when her own plans crumbled. Aldrich, who served truth above convenience. Marcus, who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of cost. And Lucian, kneeling before her with his heart in his eyes and his future in her hands. "The new moon rises tomorrow night," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "If we're going to do this, if we're going to bind ourselves in the old way and face whatever comes together, then we should do it properly." The ancient bonding ritual began at sunset as the first stars appeared in skies that had been washed clean by the storm. The castle's hidden garden, accessible only through the musical sequences that Elena had taught her, provided the perfect setting for a ceremony that predated written history. Serena wore white silk that caught the moonlight like captured stars, her dark hair crowned with flowers that had bloomed impossibly in the winter cold. Lucian stood beside her in black velvet that made his pale skin seem to glow, the ancient circlet of his office replaced by simple silver that spoke of partnership rather than dominion. Darius served as witness, his young face solemn with the weight of what he was seeing. The markings beneath his skin had calmed to a gentle glow that spoke of contentment, of a future finally secure enough to embrace. The ritual itself was older than memory, involving blood and silver and words in languages that had been ancient when the castle was young. But at its heart, it was simple. Two souls choosing to become one, two strengths choosing to unite, two hearts choosing love over fear. When Lucian slipped the bonding ring onto her finger, ancient metal that would warm at her touch and cool at his, binding them together in ways that transcended mere ceremony, Serena felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not just love, though that was there in overwhelming abundance, but peace, the peace that came from finally choosing joy over sacrifice, hope over fear, truth over convenience. "I bind myself to you," Lucian whispered, his voice carrying to every corner of the garden, despite its softness. "In power and in weakness, in joy and in sorrow, in all things, until the stars themselves burn out and are reborn." "I bind myself to you," she replied, her own voice steady with conviction that surprised her. "In choice and in chance, in growth and in change, in all things until time itself forgets our names and writes new stories in the sky." The garden erupted in silver light as the bonding took hold, ancient magic recognizing the truth of their commitment and sealing it with power that would endure beyond death itself. When the light faded, they were no longer two separate beings, but one entity with two forms, their strengths multiplied, their weaknesses shared, their love transformed into something that could reshape reality itself. The political crisis that had threatened to tear the realm apart resolved itself with surprising swiftness once word of the bonding spread. The Eastern Territories, faced with a united domain led by proven rulers, withdrew their forces and sued for peace. The Council, presented with a solution that satisfied both tradition and necessity, voted unanimously to recognize the new arrangement. And in the years that followed, as Darius grew into the wisdom and power that had always been his birthright, as the realm prospered under shared leadership that balanced strength with compassion, as love proved stronger than duty and joy, more lasting than sacrifice, the story became legend. The legend of a woman who refused to let broken hearts make her choices, of a man who learned that true strength sometimes meant choosing happiness, and of a young prince who understood that the greatest inheritance was not power, but the courage to love without reservation. But that night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the ancient castle settled into contented silence, as newly bonded souls explored the depths of connection that transcended physical touch, as a family finally united celebrated the victory of love over fear, the future was just beginning, and it was beautiful. And it